Hey guys, welcome to another tutorial by Leslie from Leslie Writes It All. Today we're going to be going over how to create these embossed journals. And as always, I provide more information in the description below, but if you want step-by-step instructions with photos, you can always head over to the blog at www.lesliewritesitall.com. So I've actually been embossing and stamping for some time, but a lot of that stuff has taken a backseat to calligraphy. So I did bring out all my stuff to kind of show you what we need to get started. So this one here is an ink pad by Colorbox. As you can see, it says it's archival dye, and on the back it says it's fast drying permanent ink. So this kind of ink is great for if you want to stamp something and then paint over it, but it's not ideal for embossing. And the reason why is because we need a slow drying ink. So a slow drying ink will allow us some time to put powder on. The embossing powder needs to go on and adhere to the ink. If it dries too quickly, like the permanent archival inks, then none of the powder will stick to any of the inks that we put on the paper. So that's why we have to find something that says slow drying ink. So usually if it says pigment on it, like that one there, it will be a slower drying ink. If it says something like dye or dye base, then it's going to be a pretty fast drying ink. And these pads say that drying time differs on the back, so you do really have to read the fine print. And if you're not sure, Ranger has a pad called the Emboss It pad. It is specifically designed for embossing, so that makes it nice and easy. You don't have to sift through and see which ones are pigment based or dye based and which ones are fast drying or slow drying. So anything that says embossing on it, for sure, you know, can be used for embossing. Next, I'm going to go over with you guys a little bit about embossing powders. So if you're new to embossing, basically you want to use a slow drying ink to either stamp out an image, or you can draw an image too using an embossing ink pen. And then you're going to put these powders on top. Now they're specifically designed embossing powders. So what happens is once we sprinkle it on, we're going to use a heating tool to melt the powder. Once the powder melts, it creates a really nice raised shiny surface, and it looks really pretty for embellishing, or if you want to use metallics or glitters, it shows up really great for that. So as you can tell, embossing powders come in a wide assortment of colors. I tend to prefer the whites and the metallics because they show up really well on dark and light paper. Sometimes not all inks show up really well on dark paper, so that's why I prefer embossing sometimes over using traditional inks. So the stamp pads from earlier are more if you're going to use a stamp to create a design. I like customizing, using my own handwriting and drawing. So that's what these pens are. They are embossing pens that have that slow drying ink in them, so you can draw whatever you want or hand letter whatever you want and then put the powder on top, and it'll still work because it is a slow drying ink. My favorite brand to use are these Ranger Emboss It pens. They come in a clear ink as well as a black ink, and they come with a brush tip and bullet tip. So that's great for drawing as well as lettering. And we definitely can't forget the heating tool. The heating tool is probably the most important part to setting the powder. It's going to melt the powder and create that really pretty, shiny, and embossed finish. So I get asked all the time what my favorite embossing powders are, or which golds I use. They're not created equally, and so I kind of created a little bit of a demo here for you guys. The bottom one is this Japanese embossing powder that I found in Japan when I was traveling. It has a little bit of glitter to it. So anything with glitter actually kind of shows up a little bit not as opaque, because the glitter kind of takes away from the embossing powder. The glitter itself doesn't really melt, so it doesn't come off as shiny. So the Ranger and the Recollections brand on the top three show up really well, while the Stampendous and this Japanese embossing powder that I found, it doesn't show up as well because they have glitter in them. So for the sake of this project, we will not be using the stamp pads, but I did want to show you guys how it works. Basically, it's a very slow drying ink, so you can stamp an image and you can keep drawing or doing whatever you need to do, and it'll still be sticky enough to adhere the embossing powder. So here I'm going to also show you the Ranger Emboss It pen. This one's a bullet tip in the clear. So this one's great for drawing. So it's going to be like monoline drawing. You're going to get one depth of line, but it's great for drawing flowers and shapes. And like I said, you can really take your time. These inks dry really slowly. The ones from Ranger, at least, I can basically draw a whole image and not have to stop to put powder on. This one here is the brush pen, which is great for brush calligraphy, which is what we'll be doing today for the journals. Just write slowly though. You do want all the ink to get on, and because it's clear, it's a little bit hard to see. But once everything is written, you can go ahead and put the embossing powder on. I do it very liberally. I always save the excess powder anyway, so I just want to make sure that everything gets covered evenly in the embossing powder. Sometimes you'll see powder sticking to places that you didn't intend it to be. It could be because of the paper you're using, or maybe you're a little bit of moisture on your hands when you were writing. I just use a watercolor brush or any brush that I have close by to wipe off excess powder and put it back into the little jar. Okay, and here's my favorite part where we melt the embossing powder. So you want to make sure that you buy the heating tool that is specific for embossing. I know people have said they tried their blow dryer, hair blow dryers, and they don't work. Basically, this is going to be low airflow, but it's going to be super hot. So it's going to be able to melt the powder without creating a mess and you're just blowing powder around. So look how beautiful that finishes. It is so opaque. It's really great for if you're going to be embossing darker papers too. It shows up really great on black. We're going to be using one more color in the series, the Ranger Copper, for our embossed journals. But I did want to show you how the other colors show up. The white shows up really beautifully as well. I really like the Paper Source white that they have, but Zing Opaque also shows up really well too. The metallics are always my favorite. They show up really well, and unfortunately the ones that have glitter on it are not my favorite because like I said, the glitter doesn't melt, and so it creates kind of an uneven finish. It doesn't show up as opaque and as dark as the other ones do. But they're really fun to play with, so I do encourage you guys to try out as many different colors as you can. I know a lot of places will actually let you demo. I know Paper Source does, so ask them to open them up and see if you can play with them and see which colors you like best. So down to the nitty-gritty of getting the journals done. I have these journals from Muji. Basically, they're a plain black cover journal. You can use any journal that has a really smooth surface. So if the cover has a very textured surface, you're going to have a hard time writing and embossing on it. So just make sure it has a really smooth surface. And what we're going to do is just trace a rectangle on the front of the cover. And if you watched my last video about floral drawings, I do have a little link to a downloadable guide for you guys on how to get started on a couple of flowers. Here, basically you're just going to draw these petals that go out in a circle and around, and they're supposed to look like little dahlias. They're pretty simple to draw, but you're just going to create a cluster of flowers on the upper left-hand corner, and we're going to create another cluster of flowers on the bottom right corner. And once you have a couple flowers drawn, you can go ahead and just accent the area with a couple of leaves. I love just a little bit of cascading leaf patterns and a couple branches too. So it just fills up the space and it creates kind of more of a whimsical pattern for you. Then we're going to draw the outline of the frame. I draw up to the point where I think I might be drawing the other cluster of flowers. So actually you can save the frame drawing for last if that makes more sense to you. I don't know why I did it this way, but it works either way. So we're just going to do the same thing on this corner, basically draw a cluster of flowers with some leaves as well. I know it's kind of hard to see that because it's clear, but it'll all show up when we put the powder on. And if you notice, I'm pretty much drawing the whole thing out and not putting any powder on. The beauty of these Ranger Emboss It pens is that I can pretty much draw for a few minutes and it still will stick the powder. I think I've gone about 10 minutes before and it still will stick. So it really depends on the pen, but these Ranger Emboss It pens I found work really well because they take so long to dry. So every time I emboss, I make a really small mess because of this part right here. We're going to cover the whole thing in powder. You want to make sure you get all the parts that you drew or wrote on because you want to cover it as liberally as you can in this powder. Then we're just going to wipe any excess off like we did earlier in the video. So before you take out your brush to get any of the excess powder off, I give it a good tap. I hold it up and then I use a pen or something else to kind of tap it really hard so that any loose powder gets dropped off already. Then what I did was I drew my flowers on top of some of that sticker residue from where the price tag was, so obviously there's like excess powder everywhere because it was sticky. Like I said, you want to make sure that the surface that you're doing it on is super smooth, and in my case not sticky. That would help the process, but I am going to clean it up a little bit with my brush. I use a really small detail brush. I think it's like a 0 round on that one, just to clean it up. And yes, now is the time for the favorite part again. I'm just going to turn it on. It heats up pretty quickly, and just set it maybe like an inch or two away from where the powder is. And you want to move quickly. If you hold it too long, it's going to burn the powder and singe it. It's going to bubble and then become flat. So once you see it kind of turning color, that's when you know that the powder is sufficiently melted. I also want to make sure that you guys are doing this safely. Like I mentioned before, that heating tool is super hot. So if you're holding that paper like I am with your hand, just make sure that you're not blowing it in the direction of your hand because it will heat it up really quickly and burn yourself. So if you can, I would put it on a flat surface, but if you have to hold it, just be real careful. And I love how it looks when you're done heating it. It just shows up so clearly and so opaquely. It looks unlike any other inks that I've used, and it also has a really pretty raised surface, so the texture of it is really nice too. So that's what makes embossing a little bit different than using like gold ink for me. It creates texture and it also shows up really, really well. The lettering portion, I am using the Ranger Emboss It bullet tip for that sans serif writing. I switched over to my Versamark brush tip pen because I think I wore out my Ranger one. It looks like it's a little bit frayed, so I think I need to get a new one. But the Versamark one works pretty well as also, although I find that the ink does dry a little bit faster. And then I came in with a serif font with the bullet tip pen for the last portion of the lettering. And just for the sake of variety, I am switching it to the Ranger copper color embossing powder. You can do this portion, and actually you can do either portion any color you want. I just love how the gold shows up, and the copper to me looks a little bit more like a rose gold, so that's why I really love this copper color as well. If you accidentally wiped off powder where you shouldn't have, you can always sprinkle a little bit more powder on. It'll still be able to stick on. And you guys, I still get excited every single time I heat up the embossing powder. I just love how it changes color. So this is still and always will be my favorite part. But I just love doing it, and I get excited watching it again for some reason. So I hope you guys like this part too, because I can't stop talking about it. But that's pretty much it. It's pretty easy to create these personalized journals. I've done like shopping bags where I put people's names on it. You can get really creative with embossing powders, and then with the use of these pens you can really personalize it so you're not limited to just using stamps. I hope you guys found this tutorial helpful, and if you guys have any questions or any suggestions for future tutorials, please don't hesitate to leave me a comment, and hopefully I can get back to you as soon as I can. This is Leslie from Leslie Writes It All with another tutorial for you. Thanks for tuning in.